evening, everybody. Don Boyd was born in Nairn in Scotland. He's a graduate of the London Film School. And Alexander Walker, the film critic, described him as a one-man film industry in his book, National Heroes, British Cinema in the 70s and 80s. He began his career working in television as the producer of the popular TV series Tomorrow's World.
Correct.
Now, during the mid-1970s, he moved into film as both director and producer. His directing debut came with a film called Intimate Reflections in 1974. This was followed by East of Elephant Rock, which starred John Hurt, who plays a British governor who takes over an East Asian colony, which after his predecessor has been murdered. During the late 1970s, Don set up his own production company, Boyd & Co. And they produced a string of successful and critically acclaimed films, including Derek Jarman's The Tempest, Lindsay Anderson's Look Back in Anger, Alan Clark's Scum, a portrayal of life in a British borstal, and Julian Temple's satirical portrayal of the rise and fall of the Sex Pistols, the great rock and roll swindle. Don was briefly lured to Hollywood in the early 1980s to produce a film called Honky Tonk Freeway, which was directed by John Schlesinger. But his true love has always been in supporting British filmmaking. He was instrumental, for example, in the careers of Stephen Fry, Ray Winston, Helen Mirren, Kathy Burke, and Tilda Swinton, to name just a few. He's also worked with some of the most artistic and talented directors in world cinema. During the 1980s, he released one of his most original and inventive films, Aria, which brought together 10 major film directors, including Ken Russell, Nicholas Roeg, and Robert Altman, in a unique cinematic and musical collaboration. It was nominated for the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 1987. He next produced War Requiem, a cinematic realization of Benjamin Britten's oratorio, which sets the piece against footage of the 20th century from the perspective of a survivor of the First World War, played by Laurence Olivier in his final ever appearance. Don's other directing credits include 21, which was written by the talented writer Zoe Heller, Kleptomania, and My Kingdom, Richard Harris starring here in his last role, set in Liverpool, by the way, a modern-day King Lear gangster film set in Liverpool. Don has directed over 20 TV documentaries, the most recent being the self-explanatory Andrew and Jeremy Got Married, which follows the romance and marriage of a gay couple. It premiered at the Toronto Film Festival and was broadcast on the BBC in the Storyville series. In 2009, Don was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Exeter in recognition of his outstanding contribution in the film industry, and he is a visiting professor at the university. He's also a governor of the London Film School. In 2010, there was a retrospective of Don's work at the London Film Festival. In June, Don released his first novel called Margot's Secrets, which is a psychological thriller set in Barcelona. During this summer's Edinburgh Festival, Don produced a series of 5 mini-plays for the Travis Theatre that were beamed around 30 cinemas around the UK, including Fact, of which he is a great supporter. He's also a great supporter of the Merseyside film industry and a close friend of one of Liverpool's finest filmmakers, Terence Davis. But tonight, to open this series, we've invited Don to offer insights on the representation of national identity in film from the perspective of a filmmaker. So can you please give a warm welcome to Don Boyd.
Gosh, thank you very much. First of all, before I start any of this, I should immediately say I'm immensely embarrassed by this sort of wonderful eulogy, because doing what I do is much more difficult than it would seem that litany of stuff I've done represents. And it's a great honor to come here and speak to people in a university environment about some of the ideas that I've had and what I believe in. It's a big privilege, and so I feel relatively humbled in that sense. But thank you, Frank. You were, at this stage, to let loose on a piece of footage from the great rock and roll swindle, and we'd have had you all stand up. Because in the film, there's this wonderful rendition by the Sex Pistols of God Save the Queen. And in a sense, that kind of irony is something that frames some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about when discussing British identity, national identity in British films. I'm not a Republican, I might immediately say. I'm a monarchist to the core. I feel a bit of a fraud in delivering this lecture at all. I was born in Scotland. I was shipped almost immediately back to China. My mother was a Russian-Ukrainian, half Russian, half Ukrainian, born in China. My Scottish father spent most of his life away from Britain. He called Britain home, but he spent all of about 6 weeks here until he retired when he was 55. And he lived in the colonies. When they were being disbanded, the sort of Union Jack came down each time we went to a country somehow. I spent my childhood in Africa. I went to a very posh Scottish school, but I speak with an embarrassingly English accent. My second language is schoolboy French. My third, Pidgin Swahili. In that sense, I'm a cultural mongrel, a nomad. And in that sense, Frank and Sonny, I have no national identity to discuss. So bear that in mind as we go along. And yet my passport makes very clear to anyone looking at it, I'm British. And so what are my spurious qualifications to be talking to you about national identity in British film? I do speak English, and in the tradition of the great pre-war filmmaker Alexander Korda, who was a Hungarian Jew, but made some brilliant British movies, including The Private Life of Henry VIII with Charles Laughton, I've almost relentlessly made many feature films which could only be categorized as British. They all ooze with what is loosely known as national identity. More about that phrase later on. As Frank mentioned, I directed a colonial saga starring John Hurt, set in Sri Lanka, called East of Elephant Rock. I produced a brutally violent expose of the peculiarly English borstal system, Scum, with Ray Winston. I produced the quintessential British rock and roll movie, according to Variety, celebrating the genesis of punk rock, starring the Pistols. And I made Derek Jarman's War Requiem, as you mentioned, which involved the work of Wilfred Owen and Benjamin Britten, an oratorio which starred Laurence Olivier and a lot of other very wonderful actors, like Nat Parker, for instance, who's regularly on your BBC television screens, Tilda Swinton, who is a legend in her own lifetime. And these then directed a couple of movies which, again, are rooted in British national identity. GoldenEye about Ian Fleming, starring Charles Dance, quintessentially British man, and My Kingdom, a modern version of Shakespeare's King Lear, starring Richard Harris, set in this very city, peopled with entirely Liverpudlian characters. I'm going to stop and tell you a little story about Laurence Olivier, which sort of, in a way, deals with the problem that you have as a filmmaker that has, in a sense, almost relentlessly been concerned with British cinema. He and I got on very well, and at a certain stage, he used to ring me up. He was very ill. He wasn't far off dying, and his nurse said that I'd revived him. And he used to ring me up quite regularly, and on one occasion he rang me up, and he said, and this was very close to shooting, and I thought, oh dear, he's going to drop out. He was 82. And I thought, oh dear, you know, the one man we want involved in this film is going to disappear. A sort of problem that all directors, producers have about sort of big stars is that they might disappear or go and decide not to do it. And anyway, he came on, and I can't do his accent, but he did call me Don, and I called him Larry. And he said, Don, I need to know how I should say this poem. I said, that's ridiculous. And he said, I'm going to do it for you. Because at the beginning of the film, he speaks Wilfred Owen's poetry. And he staggered into 6 different versions of the poem and he did a whole variety of accents. He did his northern accent, his Liverpudlian accent, he did his Newcastle accent. And then he said, and I'm sure the one you're going to want is this one, and he did an American accent, which was completely and utterly ludicrous. It's just so stupid. And I said, look, Larry, that's mad. All we want you to do is to do it in your own voice. And he said, well, I thought you might like this to be something that would be very palatable to the Americans. I said, no, that's mad. It's got to be palatable for you and us and everything else. Anyway, I tell that story by way of indicating how even somebody like Olivier, who had been in Hollywood, made tons of amazing movies, still had a sort of sense of insecurity about his own national identity. The great actor of that era, really, to many people's minds. His career epitomized the opportunities given to actors who had a strong sense of national identity when it came to directing his own movies. He made 3 great Shakespearean masterpieces, Hamlet, Henry V, and Richard III. And by the way, Richard III was produced by none other than the Hungarian Alexander Korda. But they are relentlessly British films, and they are a genre within the question of defining what a national identity would be about, which is regularly produced, which is, of course, Shakespeare films. And they set a really high standard for us all. We were going to show you a clip, but it's awkward to do so, so I shall move straight on. By the way, Korda, apart from the Shakespearean connection, and he ran various movie studios during his era, always broke, always finding it difficult to raise money. He made other Olivier films, including an extraordinary film called That Hamilton Woman, which you must try and see, which is, again, about Lady Hamilton from the era of the early 19th century, and connected, of course, with Byron, and quintessentially British film, and really worth seeing. Going back to my own sort of career, there was one sort of hugely embarrassing exception to this relentless attachment to British film when I went to Hollywood, and I worked there for 3 years with another great British director, John Schlesinger, and we made this comedy called Honky Tonk Freeway, which had 107 characters set in a landscape which was wholly American. And it cost a lot of money, $24 million in those days in 1979. It's about 100 million now. And it was a spectacular flop. It was the greatest financial disaster of my career, and certainly John's. And so when that finished, I came straight back to the UK, to a landscape I knew about. And so I have an important psychological health warning about this massive subject. Trying to define national identity can quite literally do your head in. And it really does. I mean, I've spent weeks thinking about it over these last few weeks, thinking about this lecture. Talking Liverpool, the Beatles are, and this is a lecture theatre apparently that John Lennon came to when he was an art student. The Beatles, as a British cultural phenomenon, of course, spectacularly illustrate the degree to which very specific national identity can find an international context in both the creative and cultural arenas, and financial for that matter. But there are interesting anomalies which crop up when you analyse the nature of their own catalytic influences. And we can use 3 letters to define this. USA. In the context of the influences coming from American music, the Beatles and those other groups of the 60s all publicly acknowledge their debt to something you may be familiar with to a certain extent, the Cunard Yanks. The Cunard Yanks, the influence of American art and culture on our national identity has been vast. And there was a film made about the Cunard Yanks here in Liverpool, and it characterises that well. It tells the story of them, the Cunard Yanks, who were waiters, chefs, stewards, and the like, who came to Britain, who lived in Britain and would go to America and come back to Britain on the passenger liners that crossed the Atlantic at the time, in particularly the post-war period. And they brought into Liverpool and the port here the best of American jazz, soul, rhythm and blues, and of course rock and roll. This film was ironically titled Sold Out, and in a different context exemplifies what has been one of British cinema's greatest handicaps in powerfully expressing our national identity, the massive, both intrusive and seductive impact of American culture. Again, I was going to show a bit of YouTube. I'm not going to do that. It's going to take too long and be too complicated. But go on YouTube and click up the trailer for this film, Sold Out, and it'll intrigue you. It's wonderful, and there are a variety of Liverpudlians talking about their experiences during that era and what they represented in cultural terms. And of course, the Beatles definitely acknowledged that particular link, and guitars came over that George Harrison bought, the records came over and they were played immediately. They were often played in the clubs, and clearly it influenced their music because they used to play the songs in the Cavern and the Casbah and other places like that. We've had a propensity to sell out to the Yanks, and in the cinema, of course, to Hollywood. Much of our most promising movie talent is tempted to work in the American film industry, which has the infrastructure and finance to nurture and fund their work, but of course, only to serve American audiences with their own brand of film entertainment, almost always reflecting the American sense of national identity. This brain drain has been very damaging. It isn't difficult to find examples of brilliant British film directors whose careers have been rooted in American culture. Alan Parker, from the East End of London, Adrian Lyne from Peterborough, and of course, probably most famous of all, Tony and his brother Ridley Scott, who are both Geordies. Ridley Scott's latest release, which is a Robin Hood yarn, is a woeful example of the distortion of our national identity. Entertaining perhaps for some, but plain silly in terms of anything approaching a picture of medieval life in Britain, however much Ridley might defend it. Russell Crowe as Robin, give me a break. All these directors trained in British advertising, and of course, by definition, were dealing with archetypes as far as national identity is concerned when making their highly successful commercials, always then aimed at British audiences. It is my view that if they had been harnessed to their roots, they would have been equally successful. Lyne received an Oscar nomination for directing Fatal Attraction, an American studio film shamefully based on a very good short British film, which Paramount, when they bought the rights, quite literally ordered the producers to completely destroy. They just literally destroyed the negative. Adrian then directed the American version, and it was written by James Dearden, the man who created the original short, who's also a Brit. Ironically, there are examples of great British directors whose early forays in America produced masterpieces there which exemplify American society. And this is, again, another strange thing about national identity, that you can go there and be an outsider and somehow be able to capture what national identity might be about from a completely objective perspective. The two examples I'll bring up are Alexander McKenzie, who made a brilliant film called A Sweet Smell of Success. He then went on, sadly, to have a very tragic life, in a sense, and he ended up at UCLA as a brilliant professor of film. He drank rather too much and died, but he'd influenced so many people with his lectures and his writings about cinema, but he was a great loss. He epitomized Ealing comedies, of which I will talk about later on. And then John Schlesinger with Midnight Cowboy, which was a brilliant film with Dustin Hoffman and John Voight. Both these men exemplified national identity when they made their early great work in Britain. And interestingly, their British films helped demonstrate much of what we can point to as aspects of national identity in British film. McKenzie was part of the Ealing tradition. Again, we were going to show a clip, but it's awkward. But Ealing, well, I was lucky. I was taught by the Ealing Directors when I was at film school. Their films were funny, their films were beautifully produced, wonderfully acted, they were quite satirical, and they dealt with our world. They dealt with what Britain was all about. And they were very successful. Millions and millions of people all over the world saw them and loved them. Charlie Crichton, who taught me in particular, directed The Lavender Hill Mob, which was a great classic. McKenzie directed Kind Hearts and Coronets, which is one of the most brilliant satirical looks at our class system here, and very subversive and anarchic it is. And class, of course, is a huge theme in any question of national identity here in Britain, especially in the cinema. Earlier, during that era, of course, but they were also directing and producing films during the Ealing time. you had Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, and they made a quintessentially British film called The Life and Times of Colonel Blimp, which ironically enough Churchill banned. He loathed it and wouldn't allow it to be shown at first. They won over and it was finally shown, but it was a wonderful look at the way that a British person fits in a sort of Colonel Blimp way into the whole concept of a friendship with a German, essentially his enemy. And it's a wonderful, brilliant movie that really expresses our national identity in terms of our attitudes without any of the sort of coyness that can exist when other people have tried that. Schlesinger came long after Ealing had gone and was part of the Angry Young Man Brigade of artists, another little era that, to a certain extent, characterises what national identity in British cinema has represented historically. And their films were, the group of them were misnamed, in my opinion, like kitchen sink dramas. They certainly were staples of national cinema at that time, but they did something rather wonderful. They heightened the group that had seemed to have been almost hidden in British cinema, which is the working classes who were beginning to have a voice and have a position economically. And of course they handled the class conflict from that perspective rather than from the overlord's perspective. And John made Billy Liar, A Kind of Loving, and Darling, which is an incredibly clever and quite incisive view of what the swinging 60s really represented, and not the sort of rather romantic view of what the swinging 60s was about. Other directors who worked alongside people like John Schlesinger at the time produced an amazing body of work which showed Britain as it was, its landscape. Lindsay Anderson, who made an incredibly brilliant trilogy of films, starting with If, which was a real look at the corrosiveness of Britain's society in terms of the way it's divided if it's set in a public school. Tony Richardson, Brian Forbes. And what did they use to define this national identity? They used iconography that they saw around them. They used the characters they knew and had met, the dialogue and language that we use day to day, the stories about our cities, villages and towns, our politics, all aspects of great popular cinema, all contributing to a national identity in the hands of artists who choose to work in the milieu they know best. As a retrospective challenge to the notion that popular cinema has necessarily reflected the society we live in, I'd like to talk about a pet hate of mine. And this is a distinctly unpopular opinion. I absolutely hate David Lean's so-called masterpiece, Brief Encounter. It's one of the most loathsome pieces of British film ever made. The reason I feel that, and that is not to do with his talent as a filmmaker, which is unquestionable, in it, and by the way, this was made in post-war Britain, during the time when we were trying to reconstruct our society, and we'd been through absolute hell surviving. My wife's grandfather, Lord Wilton, was the Minister of Food during the war, and lots of things come into my brain when I think about what they went through to survive during that time here in Liverpool. By the way, he was a great man here in Liverpool. But Lean made this film about two uptight, spoiled nothings, frankly, and put it into a sort of very kind of cottage villagey sort of atmosphere, and gave it an emotional sort of, how would I put it, sort of electrolysis, sort of an emotional atmosphere, which was so absolutely almost offensive to the people that had fought and won the war, and offensive to anybody else that was looking at the society that was happening in places like Italy, Japan, Germany, France, where they were trying to rebuild from this war. And by the way, their cinemas definitely did not do what we did in Britain at that time. And unfortunately, that sort of stereotype of British identity continues into nowadays. Staggeringly, we still flock to films like Gosford Park, which was directed, ironically, by Robert Altman, a friend of mine and a brilliant filmmaker. And there are tons of other examples of it. I bring that I bring that up by way of explaining what can be done in questions of national identity, so that you feel that you're dealing with something that's truthful and real, which happened in the post-war Italian period. For instance, Roberto Rossellini made an incredible film called Rome Open City in the streets of Rome immediately after the war, taking enormous risks, and he used real people, real environments, and it's emotional, it's extremely commercial. You can get it, you understand its rhythms, and you understand its poetry without feeling that you're involved in anything that's pretentious. And it was a truthful reflection of what was going on in Italian society, quite unlike David Lean's complete middle-class dross. Anyway, challenging the patrician stiff upper-lip cinema, which Lean continued to peddle very successfully to the world with Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia. He was a master filmmaker, there's no doubt about that. Was a movement which has certainly contributed to promoting a British national identity which is fundamentally flawed, and to this day is still an annoying staple for British film, epitomised by our obsession with the upper classes of yesteryear. The Duchess is such an example. On a lower level, the truly dreadful Centurions films which are now being produced. And people say, oh, that's what Britain's like. Well, it's complete nonsense. There's nothing like that when you see these terrible pieces of rubbish. I have to say that there's another irony about the Centurions films in the sense that they're being made at the newly revitalised Ealing Studios. Sir Michael Balcon and Alexander McKenzie will be shivering in their graves at the thought that their anarchic satirical comedies were the progenitor for semi-pornographic tittle-tattle about the middle classes, which says nothing about national identity at all, let alone the lives of people who live in Britain in 2010. But there is good news on the horizon, framed by the debates which come out of any study of national identity, and it's a pretty inexhaustible study. I mean, this has been, it's a huge subject with tons of books and tons of people who've talked about it. British television continues to be a very rich training ground and financing source for talents whose work has inevitably, by the very nature of parochial TV, been dealing with the world they live in. Inspired by the traditions of early public service broadcasting in the 50s and 60s, and then rejuvenated and primed by the early days of Channel 4, miraculously, a cultural heritage has emerged which is genuinely balancing the handicaps of American influence and the heritage of the post-war political landscape, followed by the Thatcher era. By the way, another pet hate of mine is the inextricable rubbish of Chariots of Fire, a Thatcher era propaganda piece, if ever there ever was one. On a massive popular scale, we cannot underestimate the cultural influences provided by soap operas like Coronation Street and your own Phil Redmond's work with Grange Hill and Hollyoaks, equally the heritage of British drama, epitomised by the Play for Today era, and carried on into today with great series like Queer as Folk and The Street. And then there's our great documentary and news traditions in television. Most recently, a movie maker, Shane Meadows, has presented a series which defines Britain in the 80s. This is England 86. As much as anything, a proper representation of national identity, as anything produced by the sort of Richard Curtis working title Universal Pictures mould of so-called British movies, which have all these influences possible coming from TV and all defining a British identity that have crucially nurtured and harboured the talents which are managing to contribute to more realistic, challenging and often poetic image of our identity on film. I'm talking about Shane Meadows there. Allowing us to hang on to some form of British identity, we have Ken Loach, Mike Leigh, Stephen Frears, Terence Davis, my friend Terence Davis, and his producer is sitting in this room. They epitomise the environment that they came from that allowed them to look at what was around themselves and produce work that reflected themselves, reflected their nation, and entertain lots of people within their own country and also abroad, without the hideous compromise that the very, very rich and commercialised directors like Parker and Scott did when they were sort of seduced over to Hollywood. Their work takes on the baton passed to them by the angry young men of the 60s, and in a sense, and they've all ignored the call of Hollywood. Not that Hollywood would have been particularly banging on their doors. I mean, Mike and Ken are both people I know. I know Mike extremely well. He's on the board of governors at the London Film School. He's passionate about British cinema. He's passionate about world cinema. He likes commercial movies too. He sees everything. But his work is relentlessly to do with what we're about and what our landscape's about. I should also mention another very important incorporation in our renewed identity, a British identity in film, which has come, interestingly, as a result of our Commonwealth, our empire, and that has been the result of the influence of Blackened Asian British cinemas, which are truly moving forward and are exciting. And they also reflect the changes in national identity and also the ambiguities and the problems of defining it too. There's a brilliant film called Bullet Boy, which I recommend, My Beautiful Laundrette, of course, which was directed by Stephen Frears, and East is East, which has a sequel coming up, Bend It Like Beckham, and the more political films of people like Horace Ove, also nurtured in British television. And there is more good news if one is looking for an authentic glimpse of our identity on film from a surprising, but welcome and fresh quarter of influence in Postwar Britain. In the same way that we feel our contemporary novelists reflect our way of life, can do, provide us with an unfiltered glimpse of our society and our national identity, and equally in the way that we have often felt the best pop music writers have done this, Lennon and McCartney being a fantastic example from a particular era, often from quite an anarchic standpoint, the Smiths, for instance, Amy Whitehouse, and in classical music for sure, Benjamin Britten, Walton, Mark Anthony Turnage, artists making work from what is around them, and then our poets, too often marginalised. Here in Liverpool you have great heritage, Roger McGough, who's somebody I've known being a personal favourite. Notwithstanding all these examples of other artists relying on their own societies for their inspiration and for building what is undoubtedly a sense of national identity, we may now have a brand new example of national identity in British film coming from, and yes, the parallel is inescapable, from a group of painters and installation artists. They've chosen film to express themselves, and their new work, and these are people who have had no alternative to working around their own environments with the psychology that represents the artistic and cultural links. And they've chosen film to express themselves, and their new work is absolutely solidly about these landscapes or historical contexts, which any Briton in the 21st century would recognise and identify. Anton Corbijn, an art photographer with his superb black and white evocation of disaffected youth called Control. Steve McQueen, who won a Turner Prize, made a brilliant film called Hunger, which was a very powerful portrait of the strike, of the hunger strike phenomenon within the Irish Troubles system. Sam Taylor Woods studied the early life of John Lennon, and two new films, unreleased, which I both hugely recommend to you, from two very different artists whose work has been in painting, sculpture and video installation. Gillian Waring, whose film premieres at the London Film Festival tomorrow, and Cleo Barnard, whose film called The Arbour, which also opens at the London Film Festival on Friday in a big gala event. And very low budget films, all of these, but very powerful and beautifully made. The Arbour is set in Bradford and borrows from the life and work of Andrea Dunbar, whose plays were entirely set in her home-time environments and within the boundaries of the council estate she lived in. By the way, Andrea Dunbar's first work was produced here at the Everyman and directed by the great Alan Clark, who directed Scum. None of this is reconstituted kitchen sink drama. I loathe that phrase, by the way. Cleo uses the backdrop of the landscape and characters to evoke many issues, not the least those connected with abuse of children, the artist's psyche, the family, repression, alcoholism, and the role of the artist, all with an incredibly powerful sense of national identity, as powerful as that from a master like Fellini or Ozu. I was again going to show you a chunk of an Ozu film or a Fellini film. The point of showing you those would have been to illustrate how you just look at a few frames and you immediately feel you're within these people's worlds. I worked with Federico Fellini for a bit, and interesting, he had a couple of interesting things to tell me. First of all, he wanted me to bring him a haggis, which I did. He felt I had to, in some way, give a sense of my national identity to him. He loved comics, DC Thompson comics. He loved James Bond movies. That's what he went to see, because he said that they demonstrated a certain kind of reflective irony, which he loved. Finally, his own work, he said, if you look at my films and you know anything about my hometown and the people I come across, you will recognize every element of them comes from that world that I've been part of. By the way, he refused to speak English to me, and yet he understood and read English. Does all of this stuff matter? How important is it to preserve a national identity? I think it's immensely important, personally. I think it's one of the most important things we have to cling on to have something to allow ourselves to be identified to somebody else as being different with our own idiosyncrasies. We were going to show a clip from a Nazi Germany propaganda film by way of warning that you can get into a terrible situation of finding yourself... Carry on, Captain. We'll talk about carry-on films in a minute. Thank you. Nazi Germany made films that they thought definitely expressed their national identity, horrifyingly so. The mountain films of Leni Riefenstahl moved on to the Triumph of the Will, and there were a whole bunch of other really nasty films which demonstrated national identity in a way that one would find completely unpalatable nowadays. And yet I'm sure everybody in Germany at the time believed that that was what they should be supporting in some way or another. Hence my warnings also about the brief encounter syndrome and the David Lean syndrome and the sort of syndrome of period dramas that I think are most unrepresentative, or often are. But anyway, jingoistic patriotism, equally something we should be very, very, very wary of. Chariots of Fire is probably an example of that. But maybe these watered-down films reflect a certain sort of lack of confidence, a loss in a sense of national identity that we're going through. I don't know. It's an interesting factor in my life that I find myself questioning that aspect of me, and I've so wanted to be British now, but especially living in London, which is such a wonderfully polyglot society, and it's interesting seeing us beginning to try to define a national identity in that revolutionary sociological change that's going on, I think. It's difficult to say. I haven't addressed comedy films since Ealing, but of course you've got the influence of Carry On, Monty Python, the Monty Python phenomenon, the Mr. Bean factor, and Simon Pegg's fantastic movies that he's been making. And of course, there's the sort of The Office coming from television and moving into cinema. I think our comedy is wonderfully representative in many ways and very, very underrated. But in that context, I'd like to tell a story about a situation that happened to me when I was flying to Manchuria to try and find out something about my mother's roots. She was born in Harbin there, in China. I was on a plane, and they were showing a movie on the plane, and I wasn't watching the screen. I was sort of looking at my notes, and actually I was shooting as well. So they were completely absorbed by the screen. And all of them were, all of the Chinese around me, and my daughter was with me, the only other person that wasn't Chinese on the plane, packed plane. And so I started to look at the screen, and it was Mr. Bean. They were laughing, they were identifying with it, they got him, they loved it. And it wasn't a sort of passive connection. They were completely absorbed by it in the way that we might be by a very, very powerful American drama, any drama. And that made me really think that there is something also about this business of other cultures absorbing and being interested in a completely alien culture. And I've always thought that that's part of the reason why foreign cinema is so often something that has a very niche and attractive audience in respective countries. And often for that reason, national cinema within its own country is somewhat undervalued. You will hear Mike Leigh and Ken Loach tell you that their films are more appreciated often abroad than they are here. Less so with Mike, but certainly in Ken Loach's case. And Ken has been wonderfully connected with his society in his cinema, and has but is loved in France, loved in Germany, loved in South America. It's great that Mr. Bean, albeit not the sort of film that Mike would necessarily make, is loved in China. I have little else to say. Ask some questions.